Hey guys, tonight we are stepping softly through misty fields, where the grass is slick underfoot and the night hangs heavy with the scent of damp earth. A faint glimmer of torchlight winks in the far distance, a hint of the village ahead. But as you move closer, it's not quite where you expect. Instead of huddled cottages atop the proud hill you thought you saw on old maps, the village lies quietly, a little lopsided, one hill over. And that is where our strange, sleepy journey begins. You take a deep breath. The air is thick with a kind of old, knowing chill, and if you squint hard enough, you might imagine the fields whispering secrets. Why would an entire village pack up its goats, its chickens, its rude wooden houses, and shuffle themselves, not to a distant land, not to some fabled city, but just a single hill over? Seems silly, right? You probably wouldn't survive this move either. Rickety carts, crumbling walls, families arguing over who gets to carry the pickled onions. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't fast. But it happened. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not post your location and local time in the comments? I always love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, your boots sinking into soft soil, and it's then that you realize something feels off. The path you're following doesn't seem worn, as if travelers had once used it, but abandoned it long ago. Stones half buried, hedges overgrown, and that stubborn scent of damp wood smoke lingering. You pause for a moment, turning to look behind you, half expecting to see movement in the fog. Nothing. This is the road into a village that used to be, the ghost of a community that once chose to vanish from its hilltop and reappear just yonder. Historians still argue whether it was famine, disease, or some deeper superstition that forced their hand. But the move itself? Undeniable. Records scratched on brittle parchment note the strange migration, even if the details have blurred with time. You reach the edge of what was once a bustling life. The crumbled outlines of old stone foundations, faint and sunken into the earth like wrinkles on a forgotten face. Wildflowers now own the place, tangled and triumphant. Fun fact, medieval villages weren't exactly where you'd want to spend your gap year. Life was muddy, loud with livestock, and smelled suspiciously like a mix of old cheese and despair. Bathing wasn't a daily hobby, and that famous Crocodile Dun sunscreen? Yeah, they had their own weird beauty hacks involving everything from lead to pigeon droppings. But even with their low standards, something about their original home just didn't sit right. The water tasted funny. The church kept collapsing. The rats were throwing parties. Oh, and there were plagues, plural. It's easy to imagine the villagers grumbling about it over weak ale, scratching their heads and cursing under their breath. Maybe old Tom the Miller pointed at the next hill over and mumbled something like, "Looks drier there." And the rest, nodding into their musty sleeves, agreed. But it wasn't an overnight decision. This wasn't a group of modern movers with boxes labeled kitchen and stuff I forgot I owned. No, moving even a single hill over was a Herculean ordeal. And they did it, chicken by chicken, child by child, timber by rotting timber. So tonight, you and I are going to follow their soggy footprints, shuffle with them through the mud, and uncover why, in the age of plagues and superstition, an entire medieval village decided they'd had enough of their hill, and moved, yes, just one hill over. You keep walking, careful not to trip over the stubborn roots that clutch at the old path. The mist thickens, curling around your ankles like a living thing, and soon the outline of what used to be the village peeks through, a ghostly cluster of stone and wood, slowly being eaten by moss and time. You wonder what they called this place, but the truth is, no one really remembers. The records are vague. Some crumbling scraps in a monastery ledger mention a name that could be Halomir or maybe Habermere. The ink had bled, the letters warped by careless fingers and centuries of damp. And honestly, medieval villages didn't always have formal names. Some were simply known as the place near the oak or the muddy one where the sheep drown. But for the sake of your journey tonight, let's call it Old Mere. You step lightly between the remnants of what might have been cottages, low, crumbling stone walls no taller than your knee, and occasional splinters of wood, gray and brittle as ancient bones. Historians still argue whether this village was ever properly recorded at all. Some believe Old Mere was little more than a cluster of poor farmers scraping by. Others insist it was once a bustling little trade stop, vital to the surrounding countryside before it simply folded in on itself. You sniff the air, damp moss, wet stone, and that peculiar nothingness that only abandoned places seem to wear. It smells like the end of things. Now, here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some medieval villages were built around things we'd find hilarious today, like a miracle well that was just particularly good at not drying up, or a rock shaped suspiciously like a cow. Superstition, resourcefulness, and a dash of convenience were all it took to pick a spot and call it home. But Old Mere? It seemed destined for a brief, struggling life. Its hill wasn't the proud, craggy kind you imagine knights clashing on. It was a low, soggy rise, barely distinguishable from the marshy fields around it. A hill only if you squinted and lied to yourself a little. And tonight, standing here, you realize why that matters. Mud sucks at your boots. The soil gives under your weight, reluctant to support even you, let alone a few hundred clumsy thatched roofs and wooden walls. Imagine living like this every day. Your home slowly sinking, your streets turning into sticky traps after every rain. Medieval folk didn't expect luxury, but even they had standards. You moved past what was likely the heart of the village, a widening of the paths, a flat patch that might have been the market square. It's easy to picture it bustling once, a scruffy farmer selling carrots so misshapen they looked like sad little goblins, a blacksmith hawking horseshoes and grumbling about how expensive iron had gotten. A chicken might have wandered by, utterly unaware of its destiny. A child splashing in a puddle, their feet caked in mud. Life thrived here, briefly, stubbornly. But you notice something else. The landscape around you dips unexpectedly in places, shallow depressions that the mist hides until you're nearly upon them. Wells? Maybe. Collapsed cellars? Possibly. Historians still debate whether these were purposeful structures or the earth itself rebelling against the villagers' presence. One thing's for sure, Old Mere's choice of location was, generously speaking, optimistic. Less generously, it was doomed from the start. Still, you have to admire their grit. They carved out a living here for decades, maybe longer, through harsh winters, blighted crops, and those suspiciously recurring colds that swept through once a year. And yet, night after night, as the fires burned low and the wind whispered through poorly fitted shutters, a thought must have crept into more than one weary mind. Is it worth it? Maybe it started as a joke, muttered over weak ale. Maybe it was a serious proposal, quickly dismissed. But the idea was planted. And eventually, it would grow, just like the weeds now swallowing Old Mere, until it couldn't be ignored. You turn slowly, the mist parting slightly to reveal the next hill over, higher, firmer, greener even under the moonlight. It's not far. A good stone's throw, a slow trudge with a full cart. But for now, you're still standing where Old Mere once stubbornly lived and quietly died, where the air still remembers the smoke of 100 fires and the grumbling of a village that would, someday soon, pack up and leave, one hill over. You shift your footing on the soggy ground and feel the earth protest beneath you, the mud clinging to your soles as if reluctant to let you leave, too. It's a wonder anyone managed to build here at all, you think, gazing around at the skeletal remains of stone and timber, half swallowed by nature. The villagers of Old Mere were hardy, no doubt about that. But even hardiness has its limits. Especially when your hill isn't really a hill and insists on soaking up every drop of rain like a grumpy old sponge. You shuffle closer to what was once the highest point of the village. Not the towering citadel kind of high point, more the if you stand on your toes, you can see your neighbor's sheep kind. Still, it's where they built their church. And, oh, the poor church. Historians still argue whether Old Mere's church was cursed or just poorly built. Either way, it had a terrible habit of collapsing. Once? Well, accidents happen. Twice? Start raising eyebrows. 3 times? Now you're in the realm of legend. Each time, the villagers rebuilt it, stacking stones with tired hands, fashioning rough wooden beams, hammering them together with more hope than skill. Each time, the structure sagged sooner than expected, the walls buckling, the roof groaning like a man with a bad back. Medieval churches were more than places of worship. They were the beating heart of the village, the gathering place for marriages, markets, and gossip sessions disguised as prayer meetings. Losing your church wasn't just inconvenient. It was a sign. A bad one. And the worst part? No one could agree on why it kept happening. Some said the ground was too soft, others blamed the workmanship. But a few, the ones who stared a little too long into the mist, whispered of other causes. Angry saints. Restless spirits. Maybe even the devil himself, displeased by some forgotten slight. Here's a fun medieval tidbit. They didn't just build churches anywhere. In fact, many early Christian churches were purposefully placed on sites already considered sacred by older religions. Sacred springs, ancient groves, pagan burial mounds. Sometimes that worked out just fine. Other times, not so much. If you're the superstitious sort, you might start wondering what Old Mere's church had been sitting on before the first stone was ever laid. You press a hand to the remnants of the foundation, the stone's slick with moss. Cold seeps through your skin. For a second, you think you can hear the faint echo of bells, but it's probably just the wind teasing the gaps in the ruined walls. Or not. Historians still debate whether sounds, bells, voices, footsteps, record themselves somehow in the stones of old places. A trick of acoustics, perhaps. Or something stranger. Either way, Old Mere's church never seemed to settle. The final collapse, as the story goes, happened during a spring service. The walls trembled, the roof groaned, and with a groan louder than a barn full of hungry cows, the whole structure came down. No one was hurt, by some miracle, or so the village priests liked to claim. But that was the last straw. You imagine the villagers gathering in the aftermath, covered in dust and frustration, shaking their heads. Maybe old Margaret the baker wagged a flour-dusted finger and muttered, "This hill's no good." Maybe the blacksmith, rubbing his aching arms, nodded in agreement. It wasn't a decision made in haste. Medieval people didn't move lightly. Moving a village was like moving a stubborn, squabbling family, and their cows, their geese, their piles of firewood, and their very sense of home. But when your church falls down 3 times, and every time you try to bless it anew it just sinks a little faster into the mud, well, even the most patient soul starts to wonder if the earth is trying to tell you something. You step away from the ruins, the mist shifting just enough for you to see the slope leading down from the so-called hill. It's barely a descent, more a gentle sag, as if even the landscape was too tired to hold itself upright. And beyond it, the next hill rises. Modest. Dry. Solid. You can almost picture them, villagers standing where you are now, muddy and grim-faced, staring at that other hill. One bold soul, maybe the village reeve, clutching his staff like it could prop up more than just his old bones, pointing across the mist and saying, "Maybe it's time we moved. Not to the next town. Not to a far-off land. Just a single hill over." A small, weary rebellion against the weight of their world. You turn, squinting through the mist toward where that defiant church once stood, now just a broken crown of stones. Imagine kneeling there, week after week, on damp ground while the roof rattles overhead like an ominous drum. If the collapsing church hadn't scared them off, surely the water would have. Because, let's be honest, even medieval villagers knew bad water when they tasted it. Old Mere's well, dug deep into the spongy belly of the hill, was their lifeline. Rainfall was unpredictable, and streams tended to turn into lazy mud puddles or dry up entirely in the hotter months. Wells were crucial, sacred, even, and this one, dug with crude tools and no small amount of back-breaking effort, should have been their salvation. It wasn't. You kneel by where the stone ring of the old well still juts from the earth, leaning in cautiously. The air is stale, metallic, the kind of smell that makes your nose wrinkle without thinking. The water once drawn from this pit tasted odd, sour, some said. Bitter, others insisted. A few more dramatic villagers claimed it was like drinking from the devil's own bathtub. Probably not a TripAdvisor favorite, even by medieval standards. Historians still argue whether the problem was minerals leaching from the hill itself, too much iron or sulfur, perhaps, or something far less scientific. Maybe it was the spirits again. Maybe the hill itself was cursed. Or, if you listen to the village gossips, and you should, they're more fun, there were rumors of a long-forgotten burial site disturbed during the well's digging, bones, old and brittle, hacked through and hastily reburied under cover of night. Nobody likes to think about that when they're gulping down a tankard of ale made from the same water. Fun fact, medieval people were deeply suspicious of bad-tasting water. They didn't understand bacteria, of course, but they knew foul water meant sickness. If water made you gag, you didn't just hold your nose and swallow, you started looking for signs, for omens. Maybe a toad fell in. Maybe a witch cursed it. Maybe the stars weren't right when they dug the well. Some said the well was haunted. Others claimed that on certain misty mornings, if you leaned in too close, you could hear voices rising from the darkness, not echoes, not wind, but whispered arguments, like a council of the dead deliberating your fate. Superstition or not, the villagers grew wary. Children were forbidden to play near the well, and there's an old, half-torn record suggesting a few livestock even refused to drink from it. You might scoff, but try getting a medieval cow to do something against its will. They're basically stubborn, mud-covered tanks with horns. As you run your fingers over the mossy stones of the well, you imagine what it must have been like, drawing up buckets of water that smelled wrong, tasted worse, and slowly realizing that no amount of prayers or purifications would fix it. One villager, a carpenter's apprentice, wrote in a rare surviving letter that he preferred to drink rainwater collected in cracked pots rather than risk the well. A choice that, frankly, might have been the difference between life and a long, ugly death by dysentery. Yet still, they stayed. They patched their church. They hoped the water would improve. They kept going, stubborn as barn cats. Until they didn't. You push yourself upright and look once more at the ground around you. It's soggy, dark, heavy with moisture. A place that refuses to be dry, refuses to give clean water, refuses to be kind. A hill that said no, again and again. And eventually, the villagers started listening. One hill over, the land looks firmer, higher, the soil the color of good bread crust instead of sludge. Maybe not paradise, no one moving with goats and wheelbarrows expects paradise, but better. Better was enough. You step back from the well, brushing dirt from your hands, and let the mist curl around you again. Above, the sky begins to lighten with that thin gray that passes for dawn in these parts. And as you glance back toward the new hill, you wonder, if you'd been them, tired and thirsty and fed up, would you have made the same choice? Would you have been brave enough to leave everything behind, even if it was only one hill away? You drift further from the ruined well, feeling the damp earth squelch beneath your boots, when the faintest crunching noise catches your ear. You pause, turning slowly. It's nothing. Or maybe it's something, because if you lived here centuries ago, you'd know to be wary when the world goes quiet. For the villagers of Old Mere, silence usually meant one thing: rats. Rats and medieval villages went together like mud and rain. But Old Mere's rat problem wasn't your average nuisance. No, these rats were practically residents, squatters with no intention of paying rent. They multiplied with reckless abandon, raiding food stores, gnawing through thatch, even scampering bold as you please across rafters during dinner. It was said you could hear them at night, their tiny feet tap dancing on the rooftops, their claws scratching a chorus in the dark. Historians still argue whether Old Mere's infestation was worse than usual, or if later storytellers simply enjoyed adding a little extra squeaky chaos to the tale. Either way, records suggest the rats weren't just a nuisance, they were a problem. A serious one. Now, quirky tidbit time, medieval villages had actual rat catchers. Full-time pest control, with a flair for the dramatic. Dressed in patchwork coats and sometimes sporting the medieval version of branding, think little carved rat tokens hung from belts, these men and women were paid a pittance to chase rodents with dogs, ferrets, and, frankly, a lot of stubbornness. And at Old Mere, the rat catchers were in high demand. There's a half-burnt scroll in a monastery archive mentioning Master Godric the Rat Man, hired after the church's second collapse to purge the infestation. Godric, legend has it, was a wiry man with a voice like a rusty hinge and a habit of talking to his dogs as if they were old drinking buddies. His chief weapon? A ferret named Agnes, fearsome and fluffy. The villagers placed their hopes in Godric and Agnes, but even they couldn't stem the tide. The rats were winning. Here's where it gets more deliciously weird. Some villagers believed the rats weren't just rats. They were seen as omens, or worse, cursed beings. Old Mere had its share of superstitions, and more than one old widow swore the rats' glowing eyes meant they were familiars of witches living secretly among them. Once, after a particularly destructive winter, a group of villagers supposedly gathered in secret to cast a counter-curse, involving, and this is real, burying a dead rat wrapped in bread dough at the crossroads under the light of a full moon. Medieval Pinterest would have been wild. You shudder at the thought, not at the rats, but at the creeping desperation that must have driven them to such measures. Rats meant spoiled grain. Spoiled grain meant famine. Famine, in a village already struggling with bad water and a rebellious church, meant the end. Still, they fought back. Traps were laid. Dogs prowled. Cats were fed scraps and treated like minor nobility. But the rats remained, fat and smug and seemingly unbothered by human efforts. One chronicle even describes a rat fall, a term not unlike leaf fall, where, during a particularly stormy night, Rats driven by wind and hunger came pouring into the village in such numbers that villagers said the ground itself squirmed. Exaggeration? Maybe. But in a world where pestilence traveled on the backs of fleas, even a small rat surge could mean disaster. It's no wonder, then, that the villagers began looking longingly at that other hill. Rats didn't mind water, mud, or rotten grain, but perhaps, just perhaps, they'd mind a move. You imagine them at night, lying in creaking beds, listening to the scurrying above, around, even underneath, wondering if tomorrow the grain bins would be lighter, if the sickness would strike again, if their children's breath would come shallow and rattling. You stare out across the low ground, tracing the gentle slope that leads toward the next hill, the better one. From here, it doesn't seem far at all. Back then, it must have felt like another world. The rats may have ruled Old Mere, but the villagers still had their hope. It was battered, muddy, and perhaps smelled a bit funny, but it was hope nonetheless. And hope, as you're learning tonight, is sometimes enough to make you pull up your roots, even if they're only tangled in the next hill over. You leave the broken well and the rat-haunted ruins behind, stepping carefully over what might once have been a muddy footpath. The mist follows you like an old shawl, settling heavy on your shoulders, muting sound and blurring the stubborn outlines of a place too tired to stay alive. As you walk, a shape materializes through the fog, or what's left of it. A hulking stone structure, squat and square, slumping into the earth like a weary old man. This was once the manor house, or more precisely, the skeletal remains of it. Every medieval village, even a scrappy one like Old Mere, owed allegiance to some feudal lord. A man, almost always a man, with lands, with titles, and, if the villagers were lucky, with at least a passing interest in the place he ruled. Old Mere's lord, however, seemed to have other priorities. Historians still argue whether he was absent out of laziness, politics, or simple disgust with the place. Some records suggest he spent most of his time in a larger, wealthier town downriver, content to let his steward collect taxes and nod sagely over complaints about bad harvests and collapsing churches. You circle the crumbling manor, noting the thick stone walls now split by creeping ivy. The place has the air of abandonment, but not recent abandonment. This is centuries of neglect, walls bowing inward, roofs long collapsed. Only a few rusted iron fittings remain, giving the faintest hint of what once was: sturdy oak doors, heavy shutters, a hall where feasts might have been eaten and petitions heard. Quirky tidbit for you: medieval manors weren't all glitz and glamour. Sure, some were castles, but most were more like glorified farmhouses. Drafty, dim, and not especially comfortable. It wasn't all goblets and furs. More like boiled cabbage and fleas. In theory, the Lord's Manor was supposed to be the village's anchor, a place of protection, leadership, and, when things got truly dire, refuge. But without the Lord's steady hand, Old Mere floundered. When the church crumbled for the third time and the well started smelling worse than the village tannery, they turned to their absent landlord for help. Letters were sent, written laboriously by the village priest, whose Latin was described as enthusiastically creative. Appeals were made. Even a few chickens were bundled up and carted to the main estate as tribute, in hopes of gaining attention. But no aid came. Legend says the steward, a man named Wulfric, came back once, frowning at the village from atop a sweaty horse. He listened to the complaints, nodded a lot, mumbled something about considerations, and then left without ever dismounting. Wulfric, villagers whispered later, hadn't liked the look of the hill. Said it was unwholesome. Not that he needed much of an excuse to leave. The manor house fell into disuse, its thatch roof rotting, its walls succumbing to the damp. The villagers scavenged what they could: beams, stones, even rusty nails, to patch their own crumbling homes. The rest? Left to the fog and the rats. Some say the Lord never returned because he heard the stories about the well, the rats, the ghostly voices at night. Others insist it was simple neglect, a rich man too comfortable elsewhere to bother with a backwater hamlet struggling to stay upright. Either way, without leadership, the villagers were left to fend for themselves. And fend they did, patching roofs, reburying wells, chasing rats with sticks and curses. But there's only so much you can do without support, especially when your best carpenter is also your worst drunk, and your best rat catcher talks more to his ferret than to people. It's around this point, after the third church collapse, the endless rat incursions, the poison well, and now a lord who ghosted them, that the first real murmurs began. The ones about leaving. About packing up everything that could be lifted, bundling children and chickens alike, and moving. Just over there. One hill over. You pause at the broken archway of the manor, its stones cold under your fingertips. In the silence, you can almost hear the whisper of parchment, the scratch of a quill, as another desperate letter goes unanswered. They didn't expect miracles, these people. They knew the world was hard and often cruel. But a little help, a token gesture from the man who owned their land, might have made all the difference. Instead, the manor rotted, the steward vanished, and the villagers stared more and more longingly at the next hill, where the grass looked greener and the ground, crucially, less muddy. You step away from the ruin, the mist swallowing it whole behind you. Hope may be stubborn, but even the hardiest hope can wither when left alone too long. You leave the crumbling manor behind, its sagging stones barely a shadow in the thickening mist. Your boots squish and slip as you follow what might once have been a well-worn trail, now little more than a memory carved into the sodden earth. The wind shifts, bringing a chill that prickles your skin, and with it, a low rumble that you feel more than hear. You pause. It's just thunder, you think. But here, thunder meant more than a rainy afternoon, it meant fear. Because once upon a time, Old Mere had the singular misfortune of being struck not by one terrible storm, but by two. Historians still argue whether it was pure coincidence, climate shifts, or divine displeasure that brought those storms crashing down in furious succession. But the villagers didn't need historians, they saw it as a sign. A big, terrifying, bolt from the heavens sign. You cross what must have been a common green, now overrun with weeds, and imagine the scene. Dark clouds boiling overhead, the air sharp with the smell of rain and something metallic, like blood and burning. The first strike hit the newly rebuilt church. Lightning danced down the crooked steeple like a snake slithering home, setting the thatch roof alight in an instant. The flames gobbled up the structure greedily, sparks spinning out into the heavy air, and the villagers, stunned, stood helplessly in the downpour, their sanctuary turned to cinders. They had barely begun to rebuild when the second storm came. This time, the lightning struck the manor, a direct hit to the already sagging roof. Fire licked at the dry timbers, and within hours, the house that once symbolized authority, protection, and permanence was a blackened skeleton. 2 strikes. 2 symbols of their village life, gone. It's a quirky tidbit, but worth noting, in medieval Europe, lightning was considered a weapon wielded by God or, if you were feeling particularly superstitious, a mark of the devil's hand. If something got struck, it wasn't random, it was judgment. Villagers gathered under whatever shelter they could find, damp barns, smoke-filled cottages, whispering prayers, clutching talismans, muttering about signs and sins and which neighbor might have angered the saints. They didn't have lightning rods yet, those wouldn't be invented for a few more centuries. No, back then you just huddled low and hoped your roof wasn't next. Some villagers, the bolder or perhaps the more desperate ones, began to say it aloud. Maybe the hill was cursed. Maybe it was the soft earth, swallowing their crops and their homes. Maybe it was the bad water, or the rats, or the restless dead beneath their well. But maybe, just maybe, it was the hill itself, tired of being lived upon, tired of their stubborn existence, now pushing back with storms and fire. Historians still debate whether medieval people truly believed in land curses or whether that's a later invention, a romantic excuse layered onto the hard truths of famine, disease, and poor planning. But standing here, with the mist heavy around you and the wind rising in a way that seems to hum against your skin, you can see why they might have thought it. 2 fires, 2 calamities, back to back. That's not bad luck, that's a message. After the second fire, the village was split. Some argued it was a test, that they should rebuild yet again, endure the hardship as a show of faith. Others whispered of leaving, of taking their families and their stubborn cows and trudging up that other hill, the one where lightning hadn't struck, where the grass seemed greener and no ominous signs marred the sky. It wasn't an easy debate. Medieval people didn't move without cause. Moving meant breaking ties, to their ancestors' graves, to the familiar paths of their childhoods, to the places where their lives, however hard, had unfolded. But as you stand there now, you can feel the weight of their choice in the air. You can almost hear them, arguing late into the night, over stale bread and weak ale, faces illuminated by guttering candlelight. Stay, and risk more fire, more collapse, more mysterious deaths. Or move, just one hill over, and begin again. It seems obvious now, but back then, it would have felt like treason against their pasts. You tilt your head, listening to the wind, half expecting to catch the faint crackle of fire, the distant roar of thunder. Instead, there's only the hush of mist against grass, the soft sigh of a place that remembers. Old Mere's fate was sealed not just by fire or storm, but by the slow crumbling of belief that this hill could still hold them, could still shelter their stubborn little lives. And when belief crumbles, even the firmest foundations can't hold. You turn your gaze again toward the new hill, still cloaked in mist, but somehow inviting. No lightning scars there. No burnt manors or blackened churches. Just a second chance, waiting. You leave the scorched memories of the old manor and church behind, trudging onward, the mist thinning just enough for you to see the slope leading toward the fields where crops once struggled. Your feet sink a little with each step, and you can feel the reluctant pull of the earth, as if it remembers centuries of disappointment. Medieval life was a gamble, sure, but even gamblers need a fighting chance. And here, on this pitiful hill, the villagers didn't have one. You crouch down, brushing aside the tangled grass to reveal the soil, dark, damp, and oddly sour-smelling, a texture more suited for sucking boots off feet than growing anything edible. Old Mere's harvests were, well, let's be polite and say inconsistent. Some years, they managed to scrape together enough barley, wheat, and root vegetables to keep the hunger away. But most years, the fields yielded thin, stunted crops, the kind that made you stare into your bowl of gruel and wonder if perhaps chewing on your shoe might be tastier. Historians still argue whether the poor harvests were due to the naturally boggy soil, the changing climate of the medieval Little Ice Age, or simply the sheer stubbornness of the villagers trying to force a hill to be something it was never meant to be. Here's a quirky tidbit: medieval farmers were pretty savvy. They understood crop rotation long before textbooks told them it was smart. They'd cycle fields between wheat, barley, legumes, and leave a section fallow to rest the soil. They even paid attention to Plough Monday, the traditional day after Epiphany when work resumed, dragging their heavy, iron-tipped plows through the stubborn ground like some communal act of grumpy devotion. But no amount of good technique could fix soil that just didn't want to cooperate. Old Mere's fields were cursed with shallow topsoil over a base of sticky clay. In dry seasons, the clay baked hard as pottery. In wet seasons, which were most of them, it turned to slop. Imagine trying to grow anything in a swamp that occasionally pretended to be a field. You stand, wiping damp soil from your hands, and look out over what would have been the village's lifeblood. Patchy, uneven ground stretches into the mist, dotted here and there by wildflowers and weeds, hardy survivors of a lost battle. By all accounts, the villagers tried everything. They drained ditches, mounted up ridges, switched crops, even borrowed techniques from travelers passing through. But every year, the same heartbreak: withered barley, shriveled carrots, and not enough hay to keep the livestock from eyeing each other nervously come winter. It's no wonder that famine visited Old Mere more than once. Starving winters weren't rare in medieval England, but here, they seemed to arrive with cruel punctuality. A bad harvest meant thin gruel, stretched too far, and children growing up with the hollow eyes of perpetual hunger. One folktale, preserved in a local priest's scribbled notes, tells of a winter so harsh and so desperate that the villagers roasted shoe leather to flavor their stews. And while that might sound exaggerated, we know for a fact that people in similar circumstances ate bark, boiled nettles, and even resorted to chewing on bones for any hint of sustenance. You shift your weight, feeling the dampness seeping up through the soles of your boots. Even now, with no plows or feet to tread it, the soil feels heavy, resentful, as if it remembers the scraping of wooden rakes and the muttered curses of frustrated farmers. At night, lying hungry on rough straw mattresses, the villagers must have dreamed of better fields. They would have heard rumors from traveling merchants and gossiping monks, tales of richer lands, where wheat grew tall and heavy, and cows fattened without trying. Was it foolish to believe? Maybe. But belief, like soil, doesn't always obey logic. Historians still debate whether it was sheer exhaustion or an actual vision, a dream sent by some benevolent saint or sly devil, that finally tipped the scales. Some claimed one of the village elders, a woman known for her odd dreams and sharper-than-average sense, saw the new hill in a vision. Green, firm, and bountiful. Dream or desperation, the idea took root. You glance again at the hill rising in the distance. It's not dramatically higher, maybe a few meters at most, but in this landscape, that's enough. Enough to keep the water from pooling. Enough to hold soil firm and give crops a fighting chance. For the villagers of Old Mere, it must have seemed like paradise. or at least, a way to survive without having to gnaw on their own shoes. You imagine them, standing in the failing fields, dirt under their nails, bellies tight with hunger, gazing across the misty expanse to that other hill, wondering, hoping, and finally, deciding. You trudge onward, your feet making soft sucking noises with every step. The mist clings, thick as old wool, but the land begins to change subtly underfoot, less squelch, more spring. A hint, perhaps, of what the villagers saw when they finally looked beyond their mud-choked fields. But before they could act on their escape plan, something happened that made their plight even clearer, something that, in the quiet corners of their simple lives, would have felt like a sign too cruel to ignore. It started with the baker. Now, old Mear's baker wasn't some rosy-cheeked, apron-wearing saint. He was, by most accounts, a gruff old fellow named Tostig, who had a talent for turning whatever scraps of grain he could find into something vaguely loaf-shaped. His bread wasn't fancy. It was dense, dark, and sometimes suspiciously crunchy, thanks, perhaps, to a little extra texture from the mill's less-than-perfect grindstones. But it was filling, and in a village like Old Mere, that counted for everything. Tostig's bakery, a squat timber and thatch building, stood near the center of the village. It wasn't just a place to get your bread, it was where news spread faster than butter on hot crust, where arguments simmered and alliances baked slowly into being. People lingered there, trading grain and gossip, stamping their muddied boots and warming their hands by the open hearth. But one spring, after a particularly miserable winter where the rats had devoured nearly every stored kernel of grain, disaster struck. The bakery collapsed. Just like that, one moment it was there, smoke curling from the chimney, the next, a hollow, splintering groan and a spray of thatch as the roof gave way, timbers bowing under rot and neglect. No lightning, no vengeful spirits, unless you counted the rats, just years of damp, muddy foundation finally winning against human stubbornness. Tostig survived, a minor miracle, but the bakery didn't. And with it went the last, stubborn symbol of community life. No bread meant no center, no warmth, no shared struggle against the cold hunger gnawing at their guts. Here's a quirky medieval tidbit: bread wasn't just food, it was everything. In fact, it was so crucial that entire economic systems were built around it. Prices were regulated, punishments for short-weight loaves were severe, think public shaming or having your ears nailed to the market post, and bakers were as vital to village life as priests or blacksmiths. So when Old Mere's bakery fell, it wasn't just the loss of a building, it was the collapse of the village's collective heart. Historians still argue whether the bakery's fall was the final straw or merely the latest in a long line of discouragements. But what's certain is that it changed something. A slow realization settled in, heavy as wet wool: this place wasn't home anymore. You imagine the villagers gathering in the aftermath, Tostig sitting grumpily atop a pile of broken beams, shaking his head. Women clutched thin shawls tighter around their shoulders. Men muttered and glanced toward the other hill, where the grass caught what little light there was and shimmered just slightly greener. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, a child pointed. "Why don't we live there?" Simple. Obvious. And, in its innocence, revolutionary. It's funny how small moments shape history, not grand battles or royal decrees, but a bakery collapsing in the mud and a child's quiet question hanging in the misty air. The villagers of Old Mere weren't fools. They knew moving would be hard. Everything they owned was heavy, sodden, awkward. The very idea of uprooting their lives and dragging them uphill, even just a short distance, must have seemed impossible. But harder still was the idea of staying. So, slowly at first, then faster, the idea spread. One hill over. Fresh start. Drier ground. Better fields. No cursed well or collapsing church. No rats, or at least, fewer of them. A dream, cautious and fragile as a first green shoot after winter, began to take root. You run your hand along the jagged remains of what might have been the bakery's hearthstone, slick with moss. Cold to the touch. Still and silent. The village's final loaf had been baked long, long ago. But over there, just over the next hill, the fire of a new hearth waited to be lit. You straighten, following the invisible path your story is weaving, the mist thinning just enough now for the distant shape of the new hill to beckon. Old Mere's death was slow, muddy, and inevitable. But its rebirth? That was just one hill away. You pull your cloak tighter against the damp and keep moving, your boots finally finding firmer ground as you leave behind the ghost of the bakery and the weight of Old Mere's failures. There's a hush in the air now, a different kind of quiet, not the silence of abandonment, but the thick, breathless pause before something stirs to life. Ahead, you can almost see it, a massive oak tree, gnarled and patient, its bare branches clawing at the mist. This was the meeting place, the heart of what came next, the long, cold gathering under the oak. Medieval villages didn't have town halls. They had trees. Big ones. Old ones. A surviving oak or elm served as the backdrop for every major decision, from marriage disputes to where to hang the new communal bell, or who was brave enough to climb up there to do it. These trees were witnesses to lives beginning, ending, and, occasionally, relocating. You shuffle closer to the imagined clearing, standing now where the villagers must have stood, shivering and uncertain. The ground here is firmer, less of a swampy sponge and more the solid, rooted earth they must have craved. Still, you imagine the scene wasn't exactly spirited. Villagers in patched cloaks, clutching each other against the cold, whispering. Chickens squawking nervously in makeshift pens. Children, wide-eyed and hushed, sensing the gravity of what was about to happen. The reeve, the village's elected leader, more or less, stood beneath the oak, leaning heavily on his staff. His name is lost to time, but let's imagine him as Aldred, a stooped man with too many winters behind him, a face like weathered leather, and the exhausted patience of someone who's refereed one too many arguments about who stole whose turnips. Historians still debate whether such meetings were formal votes or more of a noisy group grumble until everyone agreed. In Old Mare's case, the surviving hints suggest it was less shouting and more resigned muttering. One man, the miller maybe, would have grumbled about how much work it would be to move his wheel and stones. Another would point out that staying meant more of the same, mud-choked fields, poisoned water, roofs collapsing as easily as a pie crust under a clumsy hand. A widow might have sighed, clutching her shawl, and whispered that she was too old to start over. And from the back, because it's always from the back, someone would have muttered, "But if we stay, we die." Quirky tidbit for you. Medieval villages operated less on votes and more on consensus, the messy, slow art of everyone agreeing just enough to avoid a knife fight. Decisions weren't rushed. They simmered like stew over a low fire, thick with caution and compromise. So it was under that oak, in the breath-frosting chill, that the villagers made a decision. Not unanimously, it's never unanimous, but enough. They would move. Not far. No grand exodus. No brave sail across seas or desert marches. Just one hill over. A move so modest that on any other day, they might have laughed at the absurdity of it. But today it felt like salvation. They would take what they could carry. Tools, livestock, seeds, the few that hadn't rotted or been eaten by rats. They would scavenge the stones from their old homes, lift timber from the sunken frames of their cottages, and ferry their lives across the muddy gap. Not all would make it, of course. Old Aldred might have leaned on his staff a little heavier that night, staring into the dark, knowing his bones were too tired for such a move. Some would stay behind, too stubborn or too scared to leave. Every village has its anchors. Historians still argue whether they moved all at once or in waves, families trickling away like the slow dripping of a leaky roof. But move they did. You stand now where they stood, the ancient oak only a shadow in the mist, the memory of their gathering heavy in the cold air. They had no guarantees. No promises that the new hill would be better. But hope, as worn and patched as their cloaks, pushed them forward. Hope, and maybe a bit of stubbornness. You turn toward the next hill, your path clear now. A gentle rise, firm underfoot, promising, if not paradise, then a chance at something better. One hill over. A new beginning. And under that long-ago oak, the first fragile, shivering dreams of it took root. You move forward, the mist loosening its grip as if even it knows you're crossing into different ground now. Each step is easier, the earth firmer, less inclined to steal your boots with every stride. It's here, just at the edge where Old Mare's memory starts to thin, that the great, messy, wonderful chaos of moving day began. Not a single day, of course. Moving a medieval village wasn't exactly a 2 trips in a wagon affair. It was a drawn-out, stubborn ballet of logistics performed by people who'd never seen a checklist or a wheelbarrow with proper bearings. Imagine the scene, oxen lowing, carts groaning under the weight of timbers pried from old houses, chickens clucking furiously in wicker cages. Children ran underfoot, laughing or crying, it didn't much matter. Elderly villagers, wrapped in threadbare cloaks, sat perched atop teetering loads of furniture and firewood, faces set in lines of worry and exhaustion. Historians still argue whether they took everything or abandoned what couldn't be salvaged. What's certain is that what they brought was less about what was heavy or precious, and more about what was necessary. You can live without chairs, you can't live without a plow. Fun medieval tidbit: moving day meant a whole lot of creative packing. Pots were tucked inside baskets of wool, tools tied to the sides of carts with bits of twine, and the family's lone pig might ride along indignantly in the same cart as Granny Edith's mattress, much to Granny Edith's vocal disapproval. You can almost hear the din, shouted instructions, the creak of wheels straining against mud, the occasional sharp curse when a wheel found a rut or a goat refused to cooperate. Medieval goats, by the way, are about as agreeable as modern ones, that is, not at all. The villagers weren't moving far, barely a half-mile at most. But to them, it might as well have been a pilgrimage. The hill they were leaving had been home for generations. Babies born, lovers wed, old friends buried under crooked stones. Leaving wasn't just about timber and thatch. It was about pulling up roots that had wrapped themselves around the bones of ancestors. As they trudged forward, they would have passed familiar landmarks: the crooked willow where lovers once carved initials, the mossy stone wall that had long ago collapsed but was still fondly referred to as the new wall, the stream where dogs and children splashed on warm days, though fewer and fewer dared drink from it now. Some must have hesitated, standing still as the village around them dissolved into motion, staring back at what was being abandoned. A cottage half dismantled, its insides laid bare like a wounded animal. A doorway where laughter once echoed. The cold, dark mouth of the poison well, silently judging. But the carts rolled on. The oxen trudged forward. The children chased after the goats, and the mothers chased after the children, and the fathers pretended not to notice how the past clung to their heels. One hill over. That was all. And yet, it was everything. The villagers chose their new ground carefully. Not at the very top, they weren't fools. The crest was too exposed, too battered by wind. Instead, they settled just below, where the land leveled out, the soil was thick and rich, and the streams ran clear, free of the old hill's foul memory. Here's something curious: many medieval moves like this went unrecorded. They weren't grand events, worthy of chronicles or monks' quills. They were quiet acts of survival. But sometimes, in the dusty corners of monastic libraries, a note appears: the village of Mere moved from the lower hill to the higher in the year of hard rains. A sentence, no more, but enough to hint at lives uprooted and replanted. You crest a small rise, the mist lifting briefly, and you can almost see it, the new village, not yet built but already alive in the weary hope of its people. The carts are there, creaking to a halt. Oxen snort clouds into the air. Children flop onto the grass, exhausted but gleeful. Tools are unpacked, fires coaxed to life. Timbers stripped from old cottages are laid carefully on the ground, measured by calloused hands and squinting eyes. Stones rescued from the ruined manor are stacked with reverence, to become new hearths. A blacksmith, because there's always a blacksmith, drives a post into the ground, staking a claim for his forge. Historians still argue whether the move was planned in fine detail or improvised as they went, but the results are clear: a new Mere, born from the bones of the old one. You stand there, a witness centuries late, and you feel it, the stubborn, aching hope that maybe, just maybe, this time the earth would be kinder. Maybe here, bread would rise and churches would stand and rats would stay politely in the hedgerows where they belonged. Maybe here, life would cling a little longer. You stand still for a moment, letting the mist tug at your sleeves like an old friend reluctant to say goodbye. The new hill, firmer underfoot, greener even in the one morning light, is more than just a change of scenery. It's a promise. But promises, as the villagers of Old Mere quickly learned, come with their own brand of chaos. Moving the bones of a village isn't just about hauling timber and stones. It's about uprooting lives, and life, stubborn as it is, never moves neatly. Chickens fled their makeshift pens, goats tangled themselves in cartwheels, and toddlers tottered off toward the very brambles mothers had warned them about. And then came the building. Historians still argue whether they built the new Mere in any particular order or simply plunked down homes wherever seemed driest. Either way, the first few weeks were a mess of hammers, grunts, and disagreements. Every family had an opinion on where their house should go: near the stream, near the oak, not near that neighbor who'd stolen their turnips last harvest. Fun tidbit: medieval houses weren't the quaint timber frame cottages you see in storybooks. They were often little more than wattle and daub huts, woven branches slathered in a delightful mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung, topped with a thatch roof thick enough to house a minor ecosystem of bugs and birds. The villagers salvaged what they could from old Mere, beams still sturdy enough to stand, stones that hadn't yet crumbled into rubble, even the twisted iron hinges from ruined doors. Waste not, want not. They worked from dawn until the mist rolled back in at dusk, their breath visible in the chill, their hands raw and blistered. As they hammered and stacked and muttered curses that could curl the toes of the local priest, they couldn't help but glance over their shoulders at the old hill. It still loomed there, a dark, muddy silhouette. But each day, it seemed a little less menacing, a little more distant. They built slowly, unevenly. Some houses popped up almost overnight, thanks to overzealous families with too many teenagers to put to work. Others dragged on, their owners squabbling over whether the door should face sunrise or whether it mattered if the smoke hole was crooked as long as the rain didn't come in sideways. And yes, gossip moved along with them, like a stubborn, invisible cart you couldn't ditch. Old feuds were unpacked right alongside cooking pots and spinning wheels. Who had too much land? Who had too little? Who owed to a chicken from 2 summers ago? Medieval villages may have moved their bodies, but their grudges had legs of their own. And the superstitions? Oh, they came too. Some villagers swore they needed to bury a coin under the threshold for luck. Others argued for a sprig of rosemary. Still others muttered about nailing a horseshoe above the door, open end up, to catch the good fortune like rainwater. But despite the chaos, the new village began to take shape. Wobbly cottages huddled together like sheep against a storm. A central green, trampled into existence by the footfalls of oxen and children, slowly cleared itself. Someone even started sketching lines in the dirt for a new church. No steeple this time, just a simple thatch-roofed building meant more for shelter than grandeur. Once burned, twice shy, after all. And yet, as roofs were patched with thatch, as walls rose from the mud, an unease lingered. You feel it even now, standing here centuries later, a prickling at the back of your neck. The old fears didn't stay behind with the sinking ruins of old Mere. They followed, hitching rides on wagons and boots, whispering in the dark. Would the well here sour too? Would the rats find their way back? Would the storm strike again? Historians still debate whether the move brought real improvement or was just a fresh patch of earth for the same old troubles. But the villagers had made their choice. They'd rolled the dice, wagered their futures on one hill over. You kick at a patch of moss with the toe of your boot and smile despite yourself. Human beings are terrible at giving up. They'll fight the ground, the sky, and even their own pasts if they think there's a chance, even a slim, slippery one, of something better. As the mist begins to lift in earnest, you can almost see it, smoke curling from rough chimneys, the clatter of a hammer against stone, the babble of children chasing pigs through muddy yards. New Mere, not yet called that, of course, but alive. Stubbornly, defiantly alive. And for the first time in a long time, the villagers could look around at their patched-together world and think, maybe this time it'll be different. You wander further, following the ghostly echoes of hammering and gossip, the imagined buzz of a village just finding its legs again. The ground here is different, less eager to swallow you whole, more spring to your step, more give without the sink. And as you crest a small rise, the view opens up to the heart of the villagers' new gamble, the hill they chose, green and stubborn, as if it had been waiting for them all along. But even here, on this better hill, the villagers found themselves squinting sideways at their good fortune. After all, the last place had seemed good enough too, at first. They poked and prodded the earth, tested the streams, dug shallow pits and sniffed the air like wary animals. It seemed better, drier, firmer. No sour taste to the water, no unsettling groans from the ground underfoot. The grass grew thick and wild, a good sign. Their few scrawny sheep even seemed less grumpy, which is about the highest praise a medieval sheep can give. Historians still argue whether they chose the new spot by careful deliberation or sheer desperate guesswork. Some fragments suggest the new hill had been scouted months before the actual move, an unspoken plan bubbling quietly in the minds of the more practical villagers. But there were, of course, rumors. Quirky tidbit, in medieval times, land wasn't just judged by its crops or its water. No, people believed land carried memory, of old battles, old graves, old grudges. Some villagers swore the new hill was too perfect, too untouched. Maybe it was the site of an ancient settlement, long forgotten. Maybe it was sacred ground. Or cursed ground. Or both. The The medieval mind had plenty of room for contradictions. One old crone, hunchbacked and sharp-eyed, warned that the new hill was where the fae gathered on midsummer nights, cavorting in circles and stealing the scents from foolish humans. Another muttered about Roman bones buried deep beneath the soil, bones that wouldn't stay quiet forever. Historians still bicker over how much medieval villagers truly feared such things or whether these were just the comforting stories they told themselves, a way to give shape to unease, to explain away future failures before they even began. You can imagine it, dusk falling, fires crackling weakly in the half-built village, men and women huddled in doorways, staring out into the creeping dark, listening, wondering if they traded one curse for another. But practicality has a way of drowning out superstition when your stomach growls loud enough. The new hill had good soil. The stream was clean. The rats, while still around, seemed less like malevolent spirits and more like the ordinary, stubborn pests they'd always been. The villagers dug a new well, deeper this time, lined it carefully with stone, muttered a few half-remembered blessings just to cover their bases. Water drawn from it was sweet and cool. A good omen, they agreed, even if some of the older folks still cast nervous glances over their shoulders when they drank it. You walk across the imagined outline of their new homes, neat rows not yet worn by centuries, chimneys puffing thin trails of smoke into the damp sky. Chickens pecked at the fresh-turned earth, children squabbled over who got the biggest potato, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out like a heartbeat, steady and strong. It wasn't perfect. It never is. The soil was better, but still finicky. Some years would bring plenty, others barely enough. The winters still bit hard, and the plague, well, we'll get to that, wasn't too picky about which hill you called home. But it was theirs. Built with their own blistered hands, warmed by fires coaxed from damp wood, made stubbornly alive by people who refused to lie down and let the world bury them. One hill over. A world apart. You plant your feet firmly in the damp grass and turn slowly, sweeping your gaze across what once was the ruined scraps of old Mere invisible now in the mist, like a bad memory you can finally laugh about, and what was becoming New Mere, rough and raw but breathing. And you can almost hear it, the creak of new doors on new hinges, the low murmur of prayers muttered more out of habit than conviction, the sharp, quick laughter of a child unbothered by old ghosts. The villagers knew better than to think they had outsmarted fate. But here, on this hill, they had carved out something precious, a second chance. And even if the old fears still clung to them, they were learning to live with it. Because some moves, even if they're just one hill over, change everything. You trail your fingers across the rough grass as you move further into the heart of where New Mere began to rise, shaky and stubborn. The air feels clearer here, somehow, not just because you're standing on firmer ground, but because this hill hadn't yet worn them down. Not yet! Timbers were set into muddy trenches, packed tight with stone and whatever scraps the villagers had dragged from the ruins of old Mere. Thatch roofs took shape slowly, patchy at first, like badly mended cloaks. Smoke finally curled upward from crooked chimneys, signaling the return of life. You can picture it now. Houses lined up awkwardly, none of them exactly straight, because medieval people built like they lived, haphazardly and mostly by eye. No blueprints. Just hands and hope. And yet, even as they raised walls and swept soot from hearths, old habits crept in, trailing behind them like stubborn dogs. Gossip, for one. It flourished on the new hill just as it had on the old. Who was taking too long to finish their roof? Who had mysteriously acquired extra stones for their foundation? Who was seen slipping off into the woods after dark and what that might mean? New location, same village drama. Historians still argue whether gossip was a necessary glue in medieval communities or a slow poison. Probably both. It kept people connected and competitive. Kept them honest and dishonest. Then there were the old ghost stories. They couldn't leave those behind either. Children huddled close at night, listening to whispers about the hill they had left behind, how the church ruins sometimes glowed faintly in the moonlight, how the well still bubbled ominously even though no one fed it water anymore. And then came the new rumors, about strange lights seen flickering near the woods, about shapes moving where no man should be walking, about a distant ringing noise in the dead of night. Funny thing about medieval life, even when people fled their ghosts, they tended to unpack them carefully in the new place. Just in case. Quirky tidbit for you, many medieval villages had official story nights, often around harvest or midwinter, when tales of hauntings and curses were shared on purpose. Maybe it was a way to laugh at fear or a way to warn children against wandering too far after dark. Either way, superstition was entertainment, and a good excuse to clutch your neighbor's sleeve when the fire crackled too sharply. The villagers of New Mere didn't have much entertainment. No traveling minstrels, no gleaming fairs. Just hard work, harder winters, and the stories they told themselves to explain the bad luck that, inevitably, still came. Because moving didn't erase hardship. It just shuffled it around a bit. Crops had to be coaxed from the earth. Wells had to be dug and redone when the first ones collapsed. Roofs leaked. Cows wandered off. Rain came too late or too much. Babies were born and, sometimes, buried too soon. Historians still debate whether New Mere was ever truly more prosperous than Old Mere. Records are sparse, half-remembered, sometimes contradictory. But one thing's certain, they stayed longer. Long enough to rebuild the church, smaller this time, humbler. No fancy steeple, no grand bell, just a simple thatched nave where they could mutter prayers and escape the wind for a while. Long enough for generations to forget that they hadn't always lived here. Long enough for the old hill to be swallowed by mist, memory, and the indifferent creep of time. You step lightly across the invisible line where old fears might have ended and new ones began. A worn footpath, long since vanished, once stretched from here back toward the abandoned ruins. A footpath that children dared each other to walk on moonless nights. They rarely made it far. Because it wasn't the ghosts of Old Mere that frightened them most, it was the thought that they hadn't run far enough. That one hill over might not be far enough to escape whatever bad luck had clung to their muddy boots and thin wool cloaks. And yet, they stayed. You glance around, imagining the cluster of wattle and daub cottages, the thin spiral of smoke, the quiet hum of life at its most stubborn. New hill. Old worries. But also, new chances. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly good most of the time. But it was theirs. And in a world as cruel and unpredictable as medieval England, that was enough to keep building, planting, marrying, and muttering prayers against the wind. Enough to call it home. You pause, taking a deep breath as the mist coils low around your ankles, clinging to the earth like the last sighs of Old Mere. It feels quieter here, the kind of hush that hints at something forgotten lying just beneath your feet. And that brings you to one of New Mere's oddest mysteries, the mystery of the buried bell. When the villagers packed up and moved, they brought what they could carry. Timber, stones, livestock, stubbornness. But one thing they left behind, on purpose, was the old church's bell. Too heavy, they said. Too broken, others whispered. Too cursed, muttered the ones who didn't like to say such things too loud. Historians still argue whether the bell was truly damaged beyond repair or whether the villagers feared it carried with it the bad luck of Old Mere. What we know is this: instead of dragging it to the new hilltop, they buried it. Not tossed aside in a ditch, not left to rust in the church ruins. Buried. Somewhere near the ruins of the old church, maybe even directly under it, they dug a pit, rolled the heavy bronze bell into it, and covered it over with earth and stones, sealing it away like a secret too dangerous to speak of. Here's a quirky tidbit: bells in medieval Europe weren't just noisemakers. They were sacred. Blessed. In some places, bells were believed to drive away storms, disease, even demons. The Latin word for bell, campana, comes from the Campania region of Italy, where the first real church bells were cast. To bury a bell? It wasn't just practical, it was radical. Almost sacrilegious. You imagine the scene: dusk falling, mist thickening, the villagers gathered in silence. No prayers, no ceremony. Just callous hands shoveling earth, children clinging to skirts, eyes wide. Maybe a dog barked once and was quickly shushed. They tamped the soil down hard when they were done, walking away without a backward glance. The bell, they must have thought, would stay quiet. But, of course, stories have a way of refusing to stay buried. In the years that followed, villagers claimed to hear the bell on certain nights, deep, distant tolls that seemed to rise up from the very earth. Not loud enough to wake you. Just loud enough to make you lie still, heart hammering, waiting for the sound to come again. Was it real? A trick of the wind? The echo of an old life refusing to fade? Historians still debate it. Some blame swamp gases, strange acoustics, the mind's hunger for patterns. But to the villagers, it was simpler. The bell hadn't forgiven them for leaving it behind. Children dared each other to find it. None succeeded. Dogs sniffed the earth and whimpered, refusing to dig. The fields around the old church grew wild and tangled, thistles and brambles claiming what the villagers would not. In time, they stopped speaking of the bell at all, but they never farmed near the church ruins again. Not once. The land was left fallow, a scab on the skin of the landscape. You step carefully now, imagining the feel of disturbed earth beneath you. The bell is still there, they say. If you stand just right, if the night is just still enough, you might hear it, a single, low chime, so deep it rattles in your bones. Of course, you tell yourself, it's just a story. A trick of the wind in memory. Bronze doesn't toll underground. Right? Still, you find yourself listening. The mist shifts. A breeze stirs the grass. Somewhere far off, something groans, a tree branch, probably. You move on, leaving the buried bell to its restless sleep. The villagers might have thought they were burying bad luck, burying their failures, their fears, their shame. But some things, once set into the earth, have a way of echoing forever. You walk on, the mist parting briefly as you leave behind the unseen bell and the prickling feeling it left in your spine. Ahead, the land dips gently, a hollow, like a shallow bowl cradled between the ridges. It would have been a perfect spot for a pond, and maybe that's what the villagers thought they were getting when they first turned up the earth here, shovels biting into the soil with hope and sweat. But what they found wasn't water. The digging started innocently enough. A few men, pickaxes and shovels in hand, determined to dig a new pond for livestock or to serve as a watering hole during the dry months. Good land needs good water, after all, and the clearer the better. Yet not long after they started, the shovels hit something. Something that wasn't stone or clay. It was wood. Rotting, splintered, ancient wood buried deep in the earth. Not timbers from a collapsed house, but something older, heavier. The villagers dug further, curious now, hacking away at the damp soil until they revealed what lay beneath. A structure, crude and sunken, but unmistakably made by human hands. Historians still argue whether it was an old burial, a forgotten shrine, or even the remains of a pre-Roman settlement. One fragment of a 15th century chronicle mentions an ancient house of the dead found near Newmere, but whether that's a dramatic flourish or a genuine account is anyone's guess. The villagers of Newmere, of course, assumed the worst. Fun medieval tidbit, finding old bones or ruins in your fields wasn't a quaint archaeological discovery back then. It was an omen. A warning. Maybe a curse. The dead, they believed, didn't like being disturbed, especially not by a bunch of mud-splattered villagers trying to make a cow pond. The discovery threw the village into a quiet panic. Superstitions flared. Some said the bones belonged to ancient warriors who would rise again to protect their resting place. Others whispered of druids and blood sacrifices, of dark rites forgotten by the church but not by the land. Practical voices tried to reason it out. Maybe it was just an old hut, long abandoned. Maybe it was a trick of the soil, tree roots twisted into skeletal shapes. Maybe they could just fill it back in and pretend they hadn't seen it. You know, like reasonable people do. But the stories grew. Children dared each other to sneak down to the hollow at dusk. They'd hurl stones into the pit and run shrieking when the wind stirred and made the grass whisper. Even the adults avoided the area. Livestock refused to graze near it. Horses would shy and snort, pulling against reins when led too close. The villagers abandoned the idea of a pond entirely. Instead, they let the hollow fill with rainwater and debris. Over the years, it became a boggy, bramble-choked scar in the landscape, half forgotten, wholly avoided. A place you didn't go. Not if you valued your sleep. You step closer now, feeling the earth grow softer, soggier, as if remembering what was disturbed here long ago. The mist thickens, hugging the ground, and you can almost imagine the outlines of the forgotten structure still hidden below, slowly collapsing under the weight of centuries. Historians still debate what it really was. Some diggers later found fragments, bits of pottery, rusted metal, charred wood, but no one stayed long enough to investigate properly. Not when even the dogs refused to go near. Standing there now, you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the damp air. You shift your weight, the ground squelching faintly beneath your boots, and you understand why the villagers chose to pretend it wasn't there. Some secrets are best left buried. And in a village born out of the fear of old ghosts and bad luck, the last thing anyone wanted was to stir up new ones. You turn away, leaving the hollow and its forgotten house, grave, shrine, behind you. Better to focus on the living. Better to walk uphill toward the smoke and laughter, the crooked chimneys and rough-hewn walls of a village that refused to be beaten, no matter what the earth tried to whisper. One hill over, and yet still shadowed by the past. You tread back toward the heart of Newmere, leaving the hollow and its buried secrets to the mist. Your steps are heavier now, the air thicker, as if even the wind wants to warn you, not everything could be left behind just by moving a few hundred yards. Because when the plague came, it didn't care about hills. It arrived, as it always did, silently. Rats and fleas hitching rides on carts, sneaking aboard grain sacks, creeping into the warm corners of homes. Maybe it was a traveling merchant that brought it, or a pilgrim wandering through, carrying more than just prayers and news. However it came, it found the villagers of New Mere no better prepared than their ancestors had been in Old Mere. Historians still argue whether this wave of plague was part of the infamous Black Death or one of its grim little cousins, the recurrences that flare up every few decades like a terrible reminder. Medieval life was a delicate balancing act at the best of times, and even the hardiest communities lived just a few bad seasons away from collapse. You can picture it all too easily, the coughing starting quietly at first, dismissed as another cold damp spring working its way through tired bones. A child feverish and listless. A man too weak to swing a hammer. Then more. Neighbors whispering behind closed doors. Smoke rising not from hearths but from hastily lit funeral pyres. Plague didn't care about your new hill. It didn't care about your carefully dug well or your fresh thatch roofs. It came because it could. Because human beings huddled together, warm, breathing, stubborn, are easy prey. Fun tidbit, during plagues, medieval villagers sometimes turned to the strangest cures. They stuffed herbs into pockets, rubbed onions on their skin, or carried sweet-smelling flowers under their noses, a desperate attempt to ward off what they called the bad air. Yes, if you're thinking of Ring Around the Rosie, you're not far off. But all the sage smoke in the world couldn't stop it. The sick were isolated, if you were feeling generous, or simply abandoned if fear outweighed charity. Entire families were locked into their cottages, the doors nailed shut from the outside, hope abandoned along with them. You pause at the edge of what would have been New Mere's rough square, imagining the scene, smoke-heavy air, the low moans of the dying, and the eerie absence of children's laughter. Historians still debate how many the plague claimed here. Records from small villages are rare, usually scratched in the margins of a priest's ledger or guessed at from the number of new graves hurriedly dug outside the churchyard. But the silence that must have fallen would have spoken volumes. And yet, despite the terror and the loss, the villagers didn't scatter. They stayed. They buried their dead with trembling hands, muttered broken prayers, and waited for the sickness to burn itself out like a wildfire starved of fuel. You moved forward, the grass hissing underfoot, and think about the sheer stubbornness it took to endure. How they must have watched the sun rise through the mist, each morning a quiet act of defiance. We are still here. Because even the plague, ravenous and blind, couldn't kill what the villagers clung to most, that fierce, cracked belief that here, just one hill over, they had carved out something worth holding on to. New Year limped forward after the plague, scarred but standing. Homes were repaired, new babies cried in patched cradles, and crops were coaxed from the reluctant earth. Life, messy and stubborn, picked up its hammer and went back to work. And as you stand there now, breathing in the damp, ancient air, you realize that the real miracle wasn't that they moved the village. It was that they refused to let it die, even when death knocked, again and again, at their poorly nailed doors. You keep walking, feeling the soft press of earth under your boots, the mist curling close again as if reluctant to let you go. The new village is behind you now, the hollow and the buried bell long out of sight, but you can't help glancing back once, just once, as if expecting something to follow. And maybe something does, because New Mere had its hauntings too. The villagers whispered of a ghost who stayed behind. Not in the ruins of Old Mere where you might expect, not lingering by the collapsed church or the poison well, but right here, on the new hill, a stubborn spirit that refused to leave even after death. The stories vary, as they always do. Some said it was the old reeve, Aldred, who led the meeting under the oak but didn't survive the move. Others swore it was the bell's former ringer, buried in the same shallow grave as his old post. Children insisted it was a woman, draped in a muddy shroud, seen drifting between the cottages on moonless nights, her face always turned away. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers truly believed in ghosts or simply used them as convenient warnings, a story to keep children close to home, a whisper to explain why misfortunes kept returning even on fresh, untainted land. But in New Mere, the ghost was real enough to merit traditions. No doors were left unbarred after sundown. Hearth fires were never allowed to die completely through the night. If you had to walk after dark, You carried a sprig of rosemary or a lump of salt in your pocket. Little defenses against something everyone agreed was better not to provoke. Fun tidbit: medieval folks didn't just believe in spirits, they planned for them. Graves were sometimes sprinkled with quicklime to keep restless souls contained. Coins were placed on the eyes of the dead not just to pay the ferryman, but to weigh down the lids and prevent the dead from seeing their way back. It was said the ghost of Newmere didn't hurt anyone, exactly. It just was a presence, heavy and damp as the mist itself. People spoke of waking in the dead of night to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling their homes. Of doors creaking gently, not flung open by wind, but nudged by something careful and unseen. Of dogs raising their hackles and growling low, ears pinned back, staring at empty corners. And every now and then, someone would glimpse her, for most insisted it was her, standing just at the edge of the fields where the village gave way to wild grasses. Watching. Never moving. Always just out of reach. The villagers learned to live with her. They left offerings, a crust of bread here, a sprig of lavender there, on a flat stone at the edge of the fields. And when someone died, they made sure the body was carried the long way around the village before burial, to confuse the spirit, to make sure the new soul didn't linger where it wasn't wanted. You stop walking now, standing where the mist thickens again, imagining the stone where the villagers left their offerings. It's long gone, crumbled into the earth or carried off by time. But the feeling remains, that heavy, expectant silence that wraps around you, holding its breath. You don't see her, of course, or hear her, but you feel her, just a prickle at the edge of thought, like a half-forgotten memory pressing close. Historians still debate whether ghosts are real or just figments of fearful minds. You suspect the villagers didn't much care about the debate. They knew what they knew. Some things follow you, even when you move hills. Some things can't be left behind. You take a careful step forward, the mist parting reluctantly, and leave the ghost to her silent vigil. She is part of Newmere's story now, as much as the timbered cottages and the stubborn fields and the sweet well water they fought so hard to find. One hill over. A new start, yes. But the past, it seems, has a long reach. You walk a little faster now, sensing the story shifting under your feet, the mist giving way to clearer ground. Ahead, the land flattens, the hill cresting gently before dipping down into what, centuries ago, would have been a wide open expanse of fields and paths leading nowhere in particular. Newmere grew slowly, the way all medieval villages did, its cottages stitched together by the practical needs of life more than by design. But as it took root, something curious happened. It needed a name. Old Mere had never really had a proper name, or if it did, it had been forgotten, scraped away by time like a name scratched into soft bark. But here, on this better hill, the villagers wanted something new, something that would put just enough distance between their old failures and their cautious hopes. And so they called it, simply, Mere Hill. Not a grand name, but a good one. Clear. Solid. Just like the ground they had claimed. Mere Hill, the hill by the lake, or the marsh, depending on which villager you asked and how much ale they'd had. The important thing was it wasn't Old Mere. It wasn't a place of broken wells and collapsing churches and half-buried bells. It was something new. A fresh start that didn't need too many words to explain itself. Historians still argue whether the name was chosen by the priest, scribbled in the margins of a parish ledger, or if it simply grew, passed from mouth to mouth until it stuck. Either way, Mere Hill slowly replaced Old Mere in the minds of those who lived there. They didn't forget where they had come from. How could they, with the old hill always visible in the distance, like a shadow lying against the sky? But they stopped talking about it. Stopped visiting the old ruins except on rare, grim occasions. The well, the bell, the buried dead, all left to the moss and the brambles. Fun tidbit: medieval villagers were masters of erasure. They didn't tear down the past so much as quietly step around it, let it fade, let the wild reclaim it. If a church fell, they built a new one somewhere else. If a manor collapsed, they scavenged what they could and let the skeleton of it rot in peace. Mere Hill grew, and Old Mere shrank, not just in size but in memory. Within a few generations, it was no longer our old home but that place where the ground wasn't right. A cautionary tale wrapped in mist and silence. You stand now at the imagined heart of Mere Hill, where the cottages clustered close, the smithy rang loud, and the new church, humbler but sturdier, huddled under a low, heavy roof. The villagers would have gathered here on feast days, trading gossip and loaves, arguing over oxen and harvests, dancing clumsy reels when the ale flowed and the stars came out. Life continued, imperfect but persistent, like Ivy finding a way to cling to stone. An old mirror? It became a ghost, not just haunted by the one the villagers whispered about, but by the slow forgetting that time always brings. Children born in Mere Hill grew up hearing only scraps of the story, that there was once another village, over there, on the lower ground. That their ancestors had been stubborn or foolish or unlucky, but smart enough, eventually, to move. You turn, squinting through the thinning mist back toward where old Mere would lie. Nothing marks it now. No stones jutting from the earth, no crumbled wells or sagging timbers. Just a shallow rise, barely a memory in the land's skin, covered in grass and wildflowers, humming softly under the wind. It's hard to believe an entire village once clung there, stubborn as lichen, before letting go. Mere Hill stands. Old Mere sleeps. And time, as it always does, blurs the line between the two. You take a step forward, the ground firm and sure beneath you, and follow the path where lives once trailed, one cautious footstep after another, from the failures of the past toward the fragile promise of something better. You take one last, slow step through the damp grass, the mist parting gently around you, revealing the full sweep of the land. This hill, their hill, Mere Hill, rolls soft underfoot, stretching out into the quiet countryside like a tired giant finally at rest. It doesn't look like much, no grand ruins, no towering monuments, but if you know where to look, if you know how to listen, you can still hear the echoes of what once was. They say you can visit old Mere even today, though there's little left to see. Just a few stubborn stones sinking into the earth, wild brambles tangled thick over the forgotten wells, and in the right kind of silence, if you close your eyes, maybe the faint toll of that buried bell. No signs, no plaques, no tidy explanations. Just the soft hills whispering a story about people too stubborn to give up, who decided one day that they had had enough mud, enough failure, enough ghosts, and chose, not to run far, but to walk just one hill over. Historians still argue whether it was desperation or stubbornness or blind hope that drove them. Maybe it was all three. But in a way, it doesn't matter. What matters is that they moved. They packed up their broken carts, their bickering goats, their dreams worn thin as old cloaks, and they trudged forward. Not because they knew it would be better, but because staying behind would have meant giving up. And medieval villagers, much like the mud they toiled in, were never very good at giving up. Fun tidbit. Some say that on foggy mornings, when the mist rolls low over the fields and the world feels old and frayed at the edges, you can see the faint outline of the old village in the grass. Paths worn shallow by forgotten feet, depressions where walls once stood. Ghosts, not of people, but of lives lived stubbornly, fiercely, and with just enough hope to carry them to a new beginning. You stand still now, breathing in the damp air, the earth solid beneath you, and listen. There, the sigh of the wind through the grass, the distant cry of some unseen bird, the heartbeat of a place that remembers. Mere Hill survived. Not because it was perfect, not because it was easy, but because sometimes survival is a quiet, persistent thing. A refusal to vanish. A decision to keep moving, even if only by a hill. And if you ever find yourself wandering these fields, with the mist curling at your ankles and the world hushed around you, remember them. The villagers who packed up their lives and hopes and set out, not to some distant paradise, but just far enough to make a difference. One hill over. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy and the story drifts toward its quiet end, let the soft hum of the earth lull you. Let the wind carry away the last wisps of worry. Let yourself settle, like old stones sinking slowly into kind soil. The past is quiet now. The villagers are gone. The hills remain. And you? You're right where you need to be. Let's slow things down now. Imagine the mist thickening once more, wrapping the hills and fields in a soft, woolen blanket. The last sounds of the village, the faint creak of a door swinging in the breeze, the muffled bleating of a distant sheep, fade into the hush of night. The earth breathes slow and deep beneath you, and the air cools just enough to make you pull your blanket closer. The villagers of Mere Hill are long gone, their cottages collapsed into the soil, their fields reclaimed by wildflowers and time. But their story lingers, a whisper caught in the grass, a memory etched into the land's skin. They remind you that even small steps, even cautious moves one hill over, can mean survival. Can mean hope. Feel the weight of the day ease from your shoulders now. Let your thoughts settle like mist over the hills. Breathe in slowly, the scent of damp earth and old wood, and breathe out any worries you're carrying. Imagine the sky stretching endlessly above you, soft and dark, cradling the hills below. You are part of this slow, ancient rhythm now. The world spinning gently, the past and present entwined like roots in the earth. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, except here, wrapped in quiet, breathing with the hills. So rest easy. Let the story, the mist, and the earth carry you deeper into calm. Sleep well, traveler, sweet dreams.